Trina. It's good to see you again, and thank you so much for taking your time today to give us an interview on the topic of remembering the residential schools in Canada. And I hope you're doing fine. Just to give us a quick introduction also to the topic, can you tell us about the Indian residential school system in Canada?
The Indian residential school system was part of a government policy of aggressive assimilation found by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, to have constituted a cultural genocide. So from 1831 to 1995, over 100,000 Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their homes to attend these church-run, government-funded schools that were designed to kill the Indian and the child. This underfunded and poorly monitored system gave rise to neglect and abuse of every kind. High death rates of the schools, as high as 75% in the File Hills School over the period of its operation, were documented by medical examiners and known to Indian Affairs administrators as early as 1907. Despite this, the system expanded, becoming compulsory for Indian children after 1920 and later for Inuit and Métis as well. The intergenerational effects of Indian residential schools are ongoing and continue to negatively impact individuals, families, and entire communities. How the TRC defined residential schools is based on their definition within the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which adds a fairly narrow definition. The schools have to have been run by one of 5 churches that were part of the class action lawsuit that concluded with the settlement agreement and funded by the federal government. But in fact, other similar schools where similar abuses took place were part of different arrangements not covered by the agreement. So provincially run schools, schools run by other churches or charitable organizations were not covered. And subsequent to the settlement agreement, which only provided for 139 schools, there were over 1,000 applications to recognize new schools. So how residential schools are defined and what constitutes a residential school is contested. Now, I've used 3 words here, Indian, Inuit, and Métis, and I want to clarify those terms. Indian is a legal term that has been used in legislation to refer to First Peoples. So what people we now refer to as First Peoples or First Nations. Inuit are Indigenous peoples of the North, and Métis are people who are a society that's descended from early fur traders and First Nations people to create their own unique societies. So this happened in Canada's West. So we have the historic Métis Nation. So people who lived sort of in between First Nations and white settler worlds who formed their own cultures and societies that are still thriving today. So those are those 3 groups.
Thank you, Trina. So why does Canada need the tools of transitional justice to deal with the legacy of residential schools, you reckon?
That's a really interesting question. So the tools of transitional justice are often used in contexts of fragile states, of states in transition, places where governmental and judiciary infrastructure is not in place to prosecute or to reckon with in any way massive human rights abuses. So when we think of transitional justice, it's usually in the context of nations in transition. Applying it to a settler state like Canada is in some ways a misfit, and it's been critiqued. So while the tools of transitional justice are appropriate in some cases, in other cases they can be at odds with needs for things like decolonization and Indigenous resurgence. Canada participates in funding transitional justice projects, in transitional justice efforts overseas, but internally they stop at rather than in any way shifting the root causes of the abuses, they focus more on education. So, for example, in the Canadian context, there was a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It was struck in 1991. It delivered its report in 1996 and outlined a lot of the major causes of inequalities and crisis in Indigenous communities. And it called for a public inquiry. But instead, the transitional justice model was used, and from that, a TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, emerged. Now, that commission had no prosecutorial powers. It had a number of different components, so an independent assessment process to investigate and adjudicate claims of specific physical and sexual abuses, of which there were many. A common experience payment that was given to survivors who could prove that they'd attended a residential school, as well as some healing funding, commemoration funding, and of course the whole inquiry part, which involved nationwide statement gathering and nationwide events. But at the same time, as an instrument of transitional justice, the TRC didn't really have powers to prosecute or bring perpetrators to justice. So in some ways, the going from truth to reconciliation has in some ways bypassed justice. The other kind of difference is that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples made recommendations that dealt with restoration of land and land rights. And the TRC, although it put out 94 calls to action that affected or calls upon every level of government, the judiciary, the Canadian populace, all of our sectors to make changes. Within that scope, there's no impetus to restore land or land rights. So there's a part of decolonization that is somewhat thwarted by the tools of transitional justice, which focus a little bit more on truth, conscientizing publics, but not necessarily making the widespread change that is needed to address the root causes of continued injustice and social inequity.
Thanks a lot, Trina. So my next question is about how Canada formally apologized for the residential school policies of the past, and what does this apology mean to you personally? Like, how would you evaluate it?
I was present for the apology in a room outside of the House of Commons in West Block, in our Houses of Parliament, among a number of people listening to the apology, and I was moved, and we collectively cried, and I think it was an incredibly cathartic moment in some ways, but in retrospect, I don't know that it accomplished what was expected of it on the part of some of the people who lobbied the Prime Minister to give it. One of the things that it promised to do was to take the burden off the shoulders of survivors and to carry that burden without any discussion about what that burden is. And this was the Harper government, which was a Conservative government previous to the Liberal government we have in now. On the one hand, Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, apologized and claimed that he would be taking on the burden. But on the other hand, he withdrew support for community-based healing projects and facilities for people affected by residential schools. And this on the backdrop of a TRC process that was about to begin. So what happened was we had an outpouring of stories of survivors coming forth and sharing their testimonies. So really a dredging up of a lot of trauma and pain. At the same time as the critical healing programs to support them through their healing journey. I'm sorry, that sounds kind of trite, but to support them in their healing and deal with the aftermath of that kind of, I think, vulnerability was being withdrawn. So to me, that is not sharing the burden at all. And then it was a waiting game, really, among on the part of the government for the TRC to finish its mandate, to publish its final report, which it did in 2015, in the last days of the mandate of Stephen Harper and his Conservative government. And he basically waited out a change of government so that the next government would have to take on mobilizing some kind of response to the report and the calls to action, which the subsequent Liberal government has done and is in the process of acting on. So while I think the apology was really necessary for for survivors to hear, as have been the apologies from the churches, it's an important validation. It also rang hollow to many people.
Thank you for sharing this with us. The government also established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And can you explain what this is and how it worked?
So I've mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission somewhat. So there had been a Truth and Reconciliation Working Group that had been part of the class action lawsuit that resulted in the Settlement Commission that worked with the other parties to develop the mandate of a TRC. The TRC was an instrument of inquiry. Its ambition was to gather the stories of the estimated number of living survivors at that time, which was 80,000, and then to report on what happened, to reflect their experience, but also to gather all of the pertinent government records on residential schools to create as complete and accurate a record as possible of the residential school system. And the TRC were thwarted a great deal in this enterprise because the not all federal departments were forthcoming in providing their records. And a lot of these problems were financial and logistical because now they were being asked to provide millions of records, what turned out to be millions of records, without staffing to allocate to that project, without, thinking about the commitment that massive digitization would require, doing the research to aggregate all of those records. And so the records came in sort of in dribs and drabs, in kind of a non-systematic way. A number of records were withheld. The TRC tried to get a hold of the adjudication records from the independent assessment process. Courts refused, and unfortunately, the successor of the TRC, which is the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, had to take the government to court, or had to apply to the courts, rather, for a court ruling on those records and come up with a process by which they could be shared. And so the TRC also tried to gather records from our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is the federal police service, from coroner's organizations, all sorts of organizations that had in some way been involved in residential schools, the church records. But there were a number of issues. So the fact the records weren't forthcoming, timely, that they didn't come in a systematic way, the sheer number of records, numbering in the millions and millions, made it impossible for the TRC to process all of the information, and in fact even to be, I think, fully aware of what it didn't know, of what records might be missing. It's very difficult to analyze the gaps when you don't have a picture of all of the data. And so a successor organization, and this had always been in the plan, it was going to be a national research center, was created. It's called the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And they became the archive of those records. They continue to gather records. They are accessible to survivors for community-based research, to academic researchers for academic research. And they are now the body that's sort of taken over the struggle to gather as many records as possible. So it's now been 10 years since the NCTR has been established. And I think that the research is still on those records is still in its infancy, and I wouldn't be surprised if the NCTR still has a number of active collection projects on the go to try to uncover records, because new troves of records are found all the time. So the TRC, back to the TRC, after its 5-year mandate, after it interviewed all of the survivors it could, amounting to only about between 7.5% and 8% of living survivors who came forward. So really a fraction of the total. So after its mandate, collecting, a fraction of the total survivor stories, a fraction of an unknown total of records, it still had just reams of data, lots of information, lots of experiences to try to reflect, which it did in its final report. Its final report was formidable work, and the TRC issued 94 calls to action, and they're wide-ranging actions in areas of justice, education, policy, programs, funding, the media, the arts, every sector of society. And the NCTR takes over its work, and the NCTR was funded for that 10-year period, and now I believe it's continuing to look for dedicated funding, and it remains to what degree the NCTR will be able to maintain support for its work in the future.
Thanks. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission made the legacy of the residential schools visible to the public. And how were public views shaped by this, you think?
One thing the TRC did was get a lot of media coverage, an incredible amount of media coverage. So it held national events across the country. And these events were attended by thousands of people, and sometimes tens of thousands of people. There were other programs along with these events, educational programs. There were marches. There was a great deal of Indigenous cultural programming, healing circles, sacred fire, artistic programs. The national events were held in ceremony. And many, many, many survivors came out to them. Other people, fewer people who had been involved in the administration of the system, teaching, the churches were involved, archives were involved, and came to show the kinds of images of schools and information they had in their holding. It was really about gathering and sharing information, and about truth-telling. And so these were the main opportunities for survivors to participate. And so for the first time, I think, within the Canadian media, survivor stories were being covered, and that the mainstream Canadian populace was hearing about what happened to people in residential schools. So there was massive national and regional and local news coverage. There were lots of educational programs in schools, so younger generations of Canadians began to learn. So it was really kind of opening the door to something that was largely unknown beforehand. Now, it's incredible to me that it was unknown, but Years ago, certainly when I was a school-aged child, we learned about, and I'm a non-Indigenous person. We learned about Indigenous people as if they no longer populate Canada, as if they are a people of the past. Indigenous histories would be taught in the context of contact and settlement and sort of the pioneer days of Canada, when Indigenous people are among non-Indigenous people all the time. So there was certainly no information about, residential school wasn't taught at all. And in fact, Canadian history overall, up until a more critical turn, was quite celebratory, and there were other issues that as school children in my generation, of course, many decades ago, didn't learn. We didn't learn about Chinese head tax. We didn't hear about Chinese labor and deaths building the CPR, which is our coast to coast, our east to west railway. We learned about something called the Underground Railroad, which was a route that Southern slaves took to come into Canada, where they wouldn't be enslaved, to escape slavery. With the assumption that slavery never existed in Canada, which it did. Now that we're in a period where we're a little bit more critical of our history, these stories emerge. So what I'm saying about how the TRC impacted Canadians, it really threw a lot of people for a loop, particularly because the TRC was claiming that a genocide or a cultural genocide had occurred in Canada, right under the noses of Canadians, and it was going on until as late as 94, 95, 96. I mean, that was very shocking for people. So there was a tremendous amount of coverage, and there have been a lot of changes in Indigenous content in the media since that time, and also in response to TRC calls to action. So there's a lot more visibility for Indigenous people now. But like any issue, public attention has attenuated. The public is becomes focused on sort of the next thing, and so things wane. And what a number of people, I think, tried to do and continued to do, myself included, was to make sure that the curriculum changed, to make sure that if, for example, the legacy of residential schools or issues related to that aren't in the media all the time, at least that information is accessible, that it can be encountered in schools, in museums, that it's part of the curriculum, that we never sort of try to shut the door on that the reality of residential schools, which is not a history, it's not something in the past, it's a legacy. So I don't know when you went to school, but if you went to school as recently as 1996, you're in a cohort with the latest survivors of Indian residential school. It really is not that long ago, but your schooling was probably quite different.
Thank you, Trina. The Canadian government has begun to establish former residential schools as official sites of memory. What do you think, what is the impact of this official memorialization by the government?
So the project of transforming residential schools into interpretive sites is still in its infancy. And there are a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that the majority of sites have been demolished, many of them by arson, whether ceremonial or furtive. Many of the sites have been neglected to the point where they're derelict sites. Some of them have been repurposed and used for unrelated things. Many of them are in quite flung areas, so in lesser inhabited areas. The residential schools were situated at a great distance from, in many cases, although not in all cases, at a great distance from the communities in which the children they drew from lived. And that was by design to prohibit parents from trying to come and visit their children or take their children out of school. And it was really to create that distance between children and parents. Incidentally, children often who were too far to go home during the summer were incarcerated in these schools over the summer, and some may have lived in these schools for 10 years, and returning to their communities if they did, not speaking their parents' language, the Indigenous language spoken in the communities, and sometimes not recognizing their parents, and sometimes not returning. So the distance of these schools and the kind of not just from the Indigenous communities, but also from major city centers, makes them difficult sites of interpretation for people who want to visit them, for tourists, to draw people. There is an effort outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is sort of in the middle of the country, to develop a national residential schools museum. That's been a number of years in the making, and I think is maybe still a few years away from opening. There is a major effort to open a school called the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. That school is standing, and I think it's being used as administrative offices. Next to it is an amazing arts and cultural center called the Woodland Cultural Center and Archive. So there's an effort to raise funding to preserve the evidence of that school and to create a major interpretation center. And then there's another school, and this is one that I work on with the survivors of that school, which is the Shingwak Indian Residential School, and it's part of Algoma University and Shingwak Kinumagamek, which is an Anishinaabe college affiliated and co-located with Algoma University. Now, although the school has been added on to by Algoma and is occupied by Algoma, its architecture is still discernible, and the survivor community is still very, very active, and undertook a project to reclaim the school, which was called Shingwak Hall, and they did that by working with a team of people. So I was among that team to develop an exhibition called Reclaiming Shingwak Hall, and that's really to reprogram the interior spaces of the former residential school as an interpretive site. And so some of the images that you're seeing in this video are from that project. So that was a survivor-led museological project, and it was a reclamation project to give visibility to their experiences and the history of that school in an active university that brings in, for example, many international students who really, have no idea before they arrive, the place where they're learning, the provenance of the building or the history of that place. So this is one of the ways that the site is being used, but there's still, I would say, not a lot of development or redevelopment of these sites right now, but there are national conversations to try to redevelop them. There's also a site called the Missing Children Project, which was initiated by the TRC, and the initial reports were done by the TRC. And that was a project to try to document all of the deaths at the residential schools. So just to give you a sense of the conditions or the abuses of the schools, once the residential school system started operating in full force and became mandatory, a new design of building was created, and it was in a style called Collegiate Gothic, which is the style of building that was very popular the turn of the century to the 20s in North America for school buildings. And most of the schools were designed by a single architect, Roland Gurney, and they were these large institutional buildings, and they were designed with cemeteries on site. And you have to think about that. I mean, how many of you attended a school with a cemetery? Because it was known, that a general percentage of children would die while attending those schools. So this second generation of school, of which many were built, had cemeteries attached to them. And the Shingwak school that I work at with Algoma and with the survivors has a cemetery attached to that school and a register. So the Missing Children Project, which is now being revived through efforts of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, through our Federal Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Affairs, Northern Affairs, will hopefully be able to more accurately gauge the number of children who died in residential schools and and sort of account for the burials in school cemeteries.
Thank you, Trina. So my next question would be, why do you think it is important to reckon with the legacy of the residential school system?
The Truth and Reconciliation gave visibility, first and foremost, to the residential school system as the root cause of many problems. So it's now kind of recognized that the residential school system affected Indigenous peoples and families and communities in really profound ways. And some of the ways that it affected people and families and communities is that for generations and generations, children were removed from their parents at a very young age and raised in institutions that were factory-like, maybe prison-like or workhouse-like institutions where they were taught by teachers or by clergy. So you had children who were entering schools as young as 4 and 5, who after that age, 4 and 5, never had an experience of being in a family, never had an experience of sort of a family dynamic, children for whom parenting was never modeled, children who were separated from their siblings by age and by gender, and who were essentially raised in a prison-like setting. And when those children became older, their only models for how to raise children were what they learned from, the priests or the nuns or the ministers or the brothers, the teachers, the dorm monitors, the people who were responsible for them in the school, some of whom were their abusers. And so, and certainly many of these people, certainly the clergy, were not people who had experienced parenting because they had no families of their own. So, so when you have generations and generations of children leaving the residential school system and going back to their communities, there are a number of issues. So one of the issues has to do with loss of traditional parenting skills, and maybe reproducing what was learned in the system. Another was the terrible educational outcomes of the residential schools. They weren't very effective as schools in the sense that many children left traumatized and uneducated. So, and we're going back to communities where that may have been impoverished, where there was very little opportunity for to create economic security. And so, trying to reintegrate into a community is difficult enough, but having no economic opportunities was also very, very difficult. So there were issues, and there's no recourse to culture, I think, also for healing, because so many of the so much of the culture was aggressively prohibited in the residential schools, and as a result, many children who attended them lost their Indigenous languages. In fact, they were punished for speaking them. So returning to their communities, that's a further disconnect, right? So if their parents still spoke the language or spoke it exclusively, if the grandparents did, just imagine being a stranger in your own land, going back into community, and not only not being able to speak the language and thus learn from people who are there to teach you, and you know, as you know, with many Indigenous cultures, teaching is done through oral history as one way of teaching. I mean, there's also teaching through experiential learning and kind of land-based learning, but oral history is tremendously important, and culture is encoded in the language. So not only could people not necessarily connect with their connect to the knowledge, connect to their culture, but also a lot of them were inculcated in sort of white Anglo mainstream values and kind of religious, often sort of Christian values, that and racism and sort of a sense of white supremacy, where they now look down upon their parents or elders in the community as uncivilized people, which also created problems. So, you know, this is a perfect storm of conditions to create all sorts of issues. So back to your question about why do we need to reckon with the legacy? Well, residential schools underpins all sorts of issues that continue. For example, a deep suspicion of education in many Indigenous communities, where there are dropout rates among Indigenous people as high as 75%, high school dropout rates as high as 75%, right? Which is so high compared to the mainstream dropout rate. Although I should have that stat. I don't, but I suggest it's probably less than 4%. So these are lasting issues, but it's not as if residential school operated in a vacuum. It operated within a policy framework that oppressed Indigenous people on every level. And subsequent to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we had a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls national inquiry, and it looked at the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people, which is the LGBTQ community. And that inquiry concluded that the epidemic is tantamount to a genocide. So there is a compounding of many issues that need to be reckoned with, not the residential school system alone. It's a residential school upon a backdrop of many entangled issues, all of which need to be addressed. All of the root causes and sort of legacies need to be addressed to be able to reckon with the intergenerational effects. But the other thing, though, is that there are calls for decolonization and Indigenous resurgence. So what's important to kind of take away from that is the idea that Indigenous peoples are actively involved in reclaiming culture in the resurgence and sort of the renaissance of Indigenous cultures in strengthening their agency in developing nation-to-nation relationships with Canada, so not necessarily as subordinates to the Canadian state, but as sovereign nations in and of themselves in a relationship with the sovereign nation of Canada. So it's not as if settler society, in well-meaning atonement, can wave a magic wand and change all of these conditions. It's not as if Canadian society can or should. It's about supporting Indigenous efforts and not suppressing those efforts, but supporting Indigenous efforts of decolonization. It's of being allies. That's, I think, what we're really called upon to do.
Great, thank you, Trina. Have these kinds of policies been adopted anywhere else in the world outside of Canada?
So by these policies, if we talk about the residential school system, yes. Indigenous boarding schools were set up in many, many other places in the world. Australia is one of the best known examples, the Stolen Generations. So they had a residential school system sort of similar to the one in Canada. The United States had a residential school system. So the first school, or one of the first schools, was set up in the United States. I think it was the first school, was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's called Carlisle School. It was set up by Captain Richard Pratt, who was part of a society called the Friends of the Indian, and it was studied by Canadian policymakers. So Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald sent, shortly after Confederation, sent Nicholas Flood Davin, a Canadian politician, to Carlisle to meet with Pratt to look at the school. And Davin came back, wrote a report, which is now called the Davin Report, showed photos of before and after tutelage that were very, very compelling. And it started a tradition of using photography, a lot of kind of before and after photography, to convince members of Parliament in Canada that residential schools were a good investment. And there's a very famous before and after that's used in Canada of a young boy named Thomas More, who before his tutelage is shown in traditional regalia holding a pistol and looking, I suppose, like a future threat. And then in a subsequent picture, after 3 months of tutelage, is wearing a uniform and is positioned next to a potted plant, so the threat has been neutralized. And this was really strategy on the part of the government, because at the same time it was battling rebellions across the West. So the Riel Rebellion, the Red River Rebellion, and getting into conflict with Indigenous nations across the plains. So residential schools was also very much about neutralizing what the government perceived as the Indian threat. So if you would like to learn more about international boarding school experiences, there's a very good study. It's a comparative study on Indigenous peoples in boarding schools. And it was a paper by the Secretariat of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and it's available online. Its author is Andrea Smith.
So we are slowly coming to the end of our interview. I would also like to ask you if there's anything else you would like to tell us about the experiences of First Nations peoples in Canada.
So I'm a non-Indigenous person, so I refer to myself as a settler, although my ancestors have been here since the 1600s. So I can't speak for the experience. I can't speak to the experiences of First Nations people. But I would encourage you to look for and sort of witness survivors speaking of their own experiences. And there are a number of places that you can look to for these. So for example, if you go to legacyofhope.ca, you can see some videos of survivor testimony. Also, if you look at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation's website, you'll see some as well. Really, survivors have spoken for themselves. There are, over 8,000 testimonies that have been given. The TRC report, I think, reflects stories of survivors quite well. And of course, there are a number of survivor-authored works, nonfiction works, fiction works, movies, plays, art. So these are really good places to get a sense of survivor experiences. The one thing that I would say about those experiences is that we still have an incomplete picture, and we still don't know with any certainty what happened at residential school, the totality of what happened. We don't have a total record. A lot of material has been lost, has not been forthcoming, hasn't been researched. Schools, models have not been reconstructed for the schools. There's a lot that I think can be learned just by trying to reconstitute the school in some fashion, whether virtually, try to gather some of the materiality, the fabric of the schools. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the Shingwak School, is to find some way to visualize and sort of virtually materialize an earlier version of the school that's still standing, which was an industrial school that was very, very different in its program from the residential school building that came later. So there's so much that we don't know about the experiences of people who went to residential schools, and I think we need to, in our museums and in our pedagogy, make that more apparent. Make the kind of problem of evidence more apparent. I mean, there is much information that's known, but there's much that's still not known.
Thank you, Trina, a lot. Now coming to the actual end of the interview, and I would like to just finally ask you, is there anything else you would like us to know?
I think it'll be a long time before we really get a rich commemorative offering developed here. So I encourage you to kind of learn more about the Canadian context, but I also encourage you to share what you've seen happen elsewhere or the projects that you're doing. So I'm going to end it there, and I'm going to thank you for giving me some of your time and for being interested in the residential school issue. And I feel extremely privileged to be able to be the person to kind of present this to you. I also would like you to be aware that I'm doing this in my home, COVID, which sits in Ottawa, which is unceded Algonquin territory. So the Algonquin peoples are one of many different Indigenous nations in Canada. And I highly encourage you to hear about experiences from survivors themselves. As a settler scholar, I am mindful of my implicatedness in this history and of having inherited the history and being a beneficiary of the settler state of Canada, which was predicated on the dispossession of Indigenous lands. And so I locate my work in an attempt to redress those issues, to restore and to support decolonization efforts that are led by Indigenous peoples, which I regard as an ethical position as a settler. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, Trina. This has been such a great interview and such a great exchange. And thank you so much for all your input and your thoughts, and also for the work that you've been doing. I'm very sure the students will really appreciate this, and also thank you for encouraging us to do some work on this field. And the Transitional project sounds great actually, so why not? So you take care and speak to you soon again.
Take care. Stay well.